The first sound wasn't a voice. It was the soft, unmistakable cry of a baby, thin and uncertain, cutting through a courtroom that had been trained for silence. Heads turned before anyone understood why. The judge looked up. The lawyers froze mid-page. Ethan Kwan, who had rehearsed this moment for months, didn't turn at all. He was still staring forward, jaw set, convinced the sound didn't belong to his life. Then the door closed behind her. Mara Lynn stood there, not rushing, not apologizing, one arm supporting a newborn pressed against her chest, the other steadying the strap of a simple bag. No theatrics, no hesitation, just presence. The kind that forces a room to rearrange itself around you. The baby cried again, louder this time, and someone in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Ethan finally turned. Took him a second to recognize her. Took him longer to understand the baby. For a brief, dangerous moment, his face showed confusion instead of control, and that was all it took. The room felt it. The judge cleared his throat, annoyed, about to speak, but stopped when Mara met his eyes calmly and said, "I'm sorry. He doesn't like unfamiliar places." She didn't look at Ethan when she said it. She adjusted the baby slightly, murmured something soft and private, and the crying eased into quiet breaths. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Ethan's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Ethan barely heard him. He was staring at the child now. Not the way people look at babies, but the way they look at evidence. Something surfaced in his memory, sharp and unwelcome, and he pushed it down immediately. This was a divorce hearing. Assets, timelines, non-disclosure clauses. This was supposed to be clean, predictable. The judge finally spoke, voice controlled, irritation barely hidden. "Ms. Lynn, this is highly inappropriate." Mara nodded once. "I know," she said, "but he needed to be here." That was when she looked at Ethan. Not with anger, not with accusation, with precision, the kind that doesn't miss. Ethan stood halfway without realizing it, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he said, forcing a small, dismissive laugh that landed badly. "You can't just walk in here with a child and—" He stopped. The baby shifted, one tiny hand curling instinctively around Mara's finger. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but that didn't matter. There were people here who knew how to remember. The judge's gaze moved between them, calculating. "Ms. Lynn," he said carefully, "is this child relevant to today's proceedings?" Mara didn't answer right away. She adjusted the blanket, ensuring the baby's face was visible, then said, "He's the only reason I'm here." The room exhaled all at once. Ethan's lawyer spoke quickly, too quickly. "Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to manipulate the process. My client has no—" Mara raised the document slightly, not handing it over yet, just enough to signal its existence. The lawyer stopped. Ethan felt something cold settle behind his ribs. He recognized that feeling. It was the same one he'd felt years ago, the day he realized a product flaw had gone public before his team could bury it. The day control slipped. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his voice lower now. Mara finally stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until she stood across from him, the baby between them like a boundary no one had agreed on but everyone understood. "Proof," she said simply. The judge held out his hand. Mara passed the document over. It wasn't dramatic. No shaking hands. No tears. Just paper moving from one person to another. The judge scanned it, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly, then looked up at Ethan. "Mr. Kwan," he said, "were you aware of this?" Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because in that second he understood the angle. Not the baby, the timing. This wasn't about sympathy. This wasn't about embarrassment. This was about sequence. About when things happened and who knew what when. About a truth introduced at the exact moment it could no longer be contained. If you're drawn to stories where power meets consequences, where quiet decisions echo louder than shouting, subscribe now. This isn't a spectacle. It's a collapse you feel coming long before it arrives. Ethan sat back down slowly, His lawyer leaned in again, whispering, but Ethan raised a hand without looking at him. His eyes were still on the baby. "This is extortion," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You think you can walk in here and rewrite the narrative?" Mara's expression didn't change. "I'm not rewriting anything," she said. "I'm correcting it." The judge interrupted. "We're going to take a brief recess." His gavel came down, sharp and final, but it didn't reset the room. People stood, murmured, avoided eye contact. Ethan remained seated, frozen in a posture of authority that no longer fit. His lawyer crouched beside him. "We need to talk," he said urgently. "Now." Ethan nodded absently. Across the room, Mara sat, rocking the baby gently, her attention entirely on him. She hadn't come for a fight. That was the mistake Ethan had made. He had prepared for conflict. He hadn't prepared for inevitability. The recess ended too quickly. The judge returned, composed but alert. "We'll proceed," he said. "Ms. Lin, you're claiming this child has legal relevance to the dissolution of marriage?" "Yes," Mara said. "In more ways than one." Ethan's lawyer objected. The judge overruled him without hesitation. That was new. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything now. The shift in tone. The way the room leaned subtly toward Mara. The way the baby slept through it all, unaware that his existence had already altered trajectories. Mara spoke calmly, outlining dates, decisions, absences. She didn't accuse. She contextualized. She spoke of loneliness without naming it, of promises without pleading. She described a marriage that had slowly become procedural, efficient, hollow. Ethan listened, jaw tight. He wanted to interrupt, to correct, to dominate the narrative the way he always had. But every time he tried, the baby moved, a small reminder of stakes he couldn't quantify. When Mara finally said, "He was conceived during our marriage," the words landed without drama. They didn't need it. Ethan stood abruptly. "That's impossible," he said. "We were barely speaking." Mara met his gaze steadily. "Exactly," she said. The judge watched them closely now. The lawyers scribbled notes. Ethan felt something else then, something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, exposure. The realization that this wasn't about winning or losing the divorce. It was about surviving what came after. The baby stirred, eyes fluttering open briefly, unfocused, then closed again. Mara adjusted the blanket, her hand brushing the child's cheek with practiced care. Ethan looked at that hand and understood, finally, that the bone of contention wasn't custody or money or reputation. It was presence. Who had been there, who had chosen not to be, and whether that choice could ever be undone. He swallowed, slow and deliberate, as if controlling his body might restore control over the room. The judge asked him a question, something procedural, something that should have been easy to answer, and Ethan realized he had missed it entirely. "Mr. Kwan?" the judge repeated, firmer now. Ethan straightened. "Yes," he said, then paused, buying time. "I'm here." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The judge nodded slightly and turned back to Mara. "Ms. Lin, continue." Mara did, her voice steady, almost neutral, as she explained the gaps. Not dramatic gaps, not scandals, but absences that had stacked quietly over time. Business trips that never ended when scheduled. Calls unanswered. Milestones delegated to assistants. A marriage reduced to calendar invites and quarterly check-ins. Ethan listened, jaw tight, telling himself this was subjective, that stories could be shaped, that perception wasn't proof. Then she said his name, not sharply, just clearly, and looked directly at him. "You told me you didn't want children," she said. "You said they complicated things." Ethan felt heat rise in his neck. "That's not what I said," he replied. "I said timing mattered." Mara nodded once. "It always does," she said. "Just not in the way you think." The judge interjected, asking for clarification. Mara provided it, calmly laying out dates, messages, silences. She didn't read them aloud. She summarized, confident that the specifics could wait. Ethan's lawyer leaned in again, whispering about relevance, about objections, about strategy. Ethan waved him off. He was still staring at the baby, at the faint rise and fall of the child's chest, at the way Mara's thumb rested instinctively near his collarbone. It struck him then that this was not a performance. If it were, she would be louder. She would be angrier. She would be trying to win the room. Instead, she was letting the room catch up to a reality she had already accepted. The judge asked Ethan directly whether he disputed paternity. The word landed heavily. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. A denial would require certainty. A confirmation would require something else entirely. He said neither. "I need time," he said instead. The judge regarded him coolly. "Time," he said, "is rarely neutral." The hearing continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Every question now carried weight beyond its phrasing. Every answer felt like a test. Ethan noticed the way the court clerk glanced at the baby when the judge spoke of obligations. He noticed how his lawyer's confidence had softened into calculation. He noticed, most of all, how Mara never once looked to the gallery, never sought validation. Her focus never left the judge or the child. When the court recessed again, Ethan stood too quickly, the room tilting slightly as he did. He stepped into the hallway, his lawyer close behind him, voice urgent. "We need to get ahead of this," Victor said. "If this becomes about moral standing, we lose leverage." Ethan leaned against the wall, pressing his fingers into his temples. "It's not supposed to be about morality," he said. "It's a divorce." Victor hesitated. It stopped being just that the moment the child walked in. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He thought of boardrooms, of negotiations where numbers bent to will, of crises managed through silence and speed. None of those tools applied here. Inside the courtroom, Mara sat alone, the baby asleep against her shoulder. She adjusted her posture slightly, easing the strain in her back, then looked up when she sensed someone watching. It was Iris Kwan, standing near the doorway, her presence quiet but unmistakable. Ethan's mother had arrived without announcement, as she always did. Mara held her gaze, neither defiant nor deferential. Iris approached slowly, her eyes moving to the baby, lingering there longer than Mara expected. "He looks peaceful," Iris said softly. Mara nodded. "He usually is." Iris's lips pressed together. "Ethan was like that," she said almost to herself, "before he learned otherwise." The words hung between them. Mara didn't respond. Iris straightened, her composure returning. "This will be difficult," she said. "For everyone." "I know," Mara replied. "That's why I waited." Iris's gaze sharpened. "Waited for what?" Mara looked down at the baby, then back up. "For it to matter." When the hearing resumed, Iris took a seat behind Ethan. He felt her presence immediately, felt the weight of her expectations without her saying a word. The judge addressed the room, outlining the implications of what had been introduced. Temporary orders, investigations, delays. Ethan felt each word like a narrowing corridor. When the judge asked if there were further statements, Mara stood once more. She didn't add new information. She asked a question. "Your Honor," she said, "if the court determines that this child is legally recognized, does that change the conditions under which our assets were managed during the marriage?" The judge paused. "It could," he said. Ethan's lawyer objected. The judge overruled him again. Ethan felt something inside him give way, a subtle shift, like a foundation cracking without collapsing yet. He realized then that this wasn't about what he might lose. It was about what he could no longer control. The hearing adjourned for the day, the judge scheduling further proceedings. People filed out quietly, voices low, eyes avoiding one another. Ethan remained seated, staring at the empty space where Mara had stood. Iris touched his arm. "We'll handle this," she said. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure what this was anymore. Outside, Mara stepped into the afternoon light, the baby stirring slightly at the change. She adjusted the blanket, her movements practiced, unhurried. She didn't look back at the building. She didn't need to. She had brought what she came to bring. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, the city lights casting long reflections across the glass. He replayed the day in fragments. The cry, the document, the judge's eyes. He told himself he could fix this, that there were experts, strategies, settlements. Then he imagined the baby's hand again, small and insistent, and realized that some things didn't respond to solutions. They demanded reckoning. The phone rang. It was Victor outlining next steps, risks, containment. Ethan listened, responded mechanically, ended the call. He poured a drink he didn't finish. Somewhere across the city, Mara rocked the baby gently, humming under her breath, a sound she hadn't realized she'd missed making. She thought of the court, of Ethan's face when understanding finally reached him. Not with triumph, but with a quiet, heavy relief. She knew this was only the beginning, that consequences unfolded slowly, unevenly. But for the first time in a long while, she felt aligned with the truth of her own life. Ethan lay awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling, the word presence looping in his mind. He thought of meetings attended instead of moments, of choices deferred until they hardened into habits, of the assumption that everything important would wait. The next hearing loomed, but it wasn't the court that unsettled him. It was the realization that survival wasn't about avoiding loss. It was about facing what had already been lost, and deciding whether the man left afterward could still be called him. Ethan did not sleep. Morning came the way it always did, quietly, without concern for the weight a man carried into it. Pale light slipped through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his apartment, illuminating a space designed to impress but not to comfort. He lay still for several minutes, staring upward, replaying the sound of the baby's cry from the courtroom. It had been small, almost apologetic, yet it had done what no accusation ever had. It had disrupted him. When he finally stood, his movements were automatic. Shower, suit, cufflinks aligned to the millimeter. He studied his reflection longer than usual, searching for signs of weakness and finding none, which unsettled him more than if he had. By the time his driver pulled into the underground entrance of his company's headquarters, the story had already begun to move. Not in headlines, not on screens. It moved the way real threats do, through private calls, careful pauses, conversations that ended a fraction too quickly. Inside the elevator, Ethan felt the familiar pressure of altitude and authority, a space where decisions were expected of him and not explanations. He adjusted his collar, reminding himself that nothing had been proven. Nothing had been decided. This was still procedural, still containable. Victor Hale was waiting when the doors opened. He held his tablet low, his expression professionally neutral. "We've managed to keep it internal," Victor said as they walked. "No leaks, no press." Ethan nodded once. "And the board? They're aware something is happening. They want reassurance." Ethan stopped in front of his office door. "They'll get it." Inside, he reviewed reports he barely read, signed documents that required no thought, participated in calls where his voice remained steady and his mind wandered back to the courtroom. The baby, the way Mara had stood without flinching, the absence of triumph in her face. That absence unsettled him more than anger would have. The board meeting was scheduled for noon. 12 people who had built empires alongside him sat around a polished table, their expressions calibrated for professionalism. Ethan spoke first, framing the situation as a personal matter intersecting briefly with legal proceedings. Nothing that compromised governance or strategic direction. He spoke well, confidently, the way men in power are trained to speak when uncertainty must be minimized. Questions followed, measured and polite. Then one director, older than the rest, asked whether the existence of a potential heir introduced fiduciary complexity. Ethan felt the room lean in. He responded carefully, outlining contingencies, legal structures, safeguards. He avoided names. When the meeting ended, he was exhausted in a way no financial negotiation had ever managed to produce. Across the city, Mara sat in a pediatric clinic, the baby asleep against her chest. She listened as a nurse explained feeding intervals and developmental milestones, nodded, asked practical questions. When the nurse asked about the father, Mara paused just long enough to consider honesty versus simplicity. "He's aware," she said. It was enough. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from an unknown number asked if she was open to discussing terms privately. She did not reply. She had learned that urgency was often a strategy, not a necessity. That afternoon, Ethan visited his mother. Iris Kwan lived in an apartment she had refused to upgrade, its modesty a quiet defiance of the wealth that surrounded her family name. She poured tea without asking questions, observing him with the patience of someone who had watched storms pass before. "You look thin," she said. "I'm busy," Ethan replied. Iris waited. "She's strong," she said finally. Ethan frowned. "This isn't admiration," he said. Iris met his gaze. "Everything becomes about character eventually," she replied. He stood, restless. "She's using the child," he said, more to convince himself than her. Iris's voice hardened. "Be careful," she said. "If you tell yourself that long enough, you'll believe it. And then you'll miss the truth standing in front of you." The second hearing approached with alarming speed. Motions were filed. Experts retained. Ethan's legal team prepared scenarios designed to minimize exposure and preserve leverage. Victor spoke of settlements, of agreements sealed behind closed doors. "What does she want?" Ethan asked. Victor hesitated. "Security," he said. "Control over how this unfolds." Ethan laughed softly. "Control," he said. "That's ironic." Victor watched him closely. "Is it?" he asked. When Mara arrived at the courthouse again, the shock had been replaced by scrutiny. Eyes lingered longer. Whispers followed. She adjusted the baby's blanket and walked in without hesitation. Ethan was already seated, his posture rigid, his face carefully composed. Their eyes met briefly. No hostility. No warmth. Recognition without resolution. The judge entered, and the proceedings resumed with sharper focus. Evidence was introduced methodically. Ethan's team emphasized uncertainty and caution, warning against assumptions. Mara's counsel spoke less, allowing documents to speak instead. When the judge asked Ethan whether he would consent to a paternity test, the room went silent. Ethan considered refusal delay strategy. He imagined the cost of denial stretching far beyond the courtroom. "Yes," he said. The word felt heavier than he expected. Outside, reporters gathered, restrained but alert. Mara passed without comment. Ethan followed later, ignoring shouted questions. That night, alone again, he stared at the city and tried to remember when he had last made a decision without calculating its return. He couldn't. Days passed. The test was scheduled. Results pending. In the interim, temporary arrangements were discussed. Support. Boundaries. Ethan signed documents with steady hands, telling himself this was precaution, not concession. At night, he dreamed of a small hand reaching for something just out of reach. When the results arrived, they did so without drama. An envelope placed on his desk by an assistant who avoided his eyes. Ethan stared at it before opening it, bracing for an impact that came slowly. The language was clinical, the conclusion unmistakable. He sat back, the chair creaking softly. Confirmation without narrative. Proof without explanation. He felt nothing at first. Then, gradually, a weight settled in his chest. He was a father. The word felt unfamiliar, ill-fitting. He called Victor. "It's confirmed," he said. Victor exhaled. "We'll adjust," he replied. Ethan ended the call. Mara received the news through her counsel. She closed her eyes briefly, not in triumph, but relief. One uncertainty resolved. She looked at the baby, now awake, eyes tracking light, and felt a quiet resolve settle. This was not an ending. It was a beginning she would navigate carefully. The next hearing was shorter. Formal recognition. Adjustments. The judge spoke of responsibility, of the child's interests. Ethan listened, absorbing words that once would have slid past him. When it was over, he remained seated as the room emptied. Iris touched his arm. "You did what was necessary," she said. Ethan nodded. "Necessary," he repeated. In the weeks that followed, the fallout continued, subtle but persistent. Invitations changed. Conversations paused when he entered rooms. Nothing overt. Nothing actionable. Just recalibration. Ethan worked longer hours, pushing himself as if productivity could restore balance. Didn't. At night, he found himself thinking of the baby's breathing, the steady rhythm he had noticed in court. He requested photos through intermediaries, then stopped himself, unsettled by the impulse. One evening he called Mara directly. She answered after several rings. "What do you want?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "I don't know," he said honestly. There was a pause. "That's a beginning," she replied. He asked to see the child. "Not yet," she said. Boundaries mattered. He accepted that, surprised by his own compliance. As arrangements were negotiated, Ethan confronted a truth he had long avoided. Presence could not be retroactively applied. Resources could not replace time. Attention could not be delegated. He could only decide what came next. The realization was both limiting and clarifying. He canceled meetings, declined travel, created space in his life that felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable. People noticed. Rumors softened into curiosity. Ethan stopped caring which. Months after the first hearing, Ethan stood outside Mara's building, waiting. When she opened the door with the baby in her arms, he felt the same internal shift he had felt in court. She stepped aside, allowing him in. The apartment was simple, warm. He sat awkwardly, hands clasped. Mara placed the baby in his arms with careful instruction. Ethan held him stiffly at first, then adjusted, the weight grounding him in a way nothing else had. The baby blinked up at him, unfocused, then settled. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. Not redemption, not absolution, just connection. Later, walking back to his car, Ethan understood something he would take years to articulate. He had not been destroyed by the revelation. He had been dismantled piece by piece by a truth that demanded reconstruction without avoidance. Survival, he realized, was not about emerging unchanged. It was about enduring transformation without turning away. What happens when the truth doesn't explode, but keeps spreading, quietly, into every corner of a life you thought was sealed? And if you're here for stories where power is tested by consequence rather than spectacle, take a second now to subscribe and follow. This chapter is where certainty finally breaks. Ethan Kwan learned that silence could be louder than scandal. It began the week after the test results were filed, not with headlines or statements, but with hesitation. A meeting postponed without explanation. A dinner invitation that arrived and was then quietly withdrawn. A colleague who took an extra second before returning a greeting. These were small things, the kind that never appeared in reports, but together they formed a pattern Ethan recognized from hostile markets. Confidence thinning, trust recalibrating. He told himself it was temporary, that once procedures concluded and narratives settled, equilibrium would return. He had built entire systems on that belief. But this wasn't a market. It was a human reckoning unfolding in real time, indifferent to timelines. He adjusted his schedule to appear unaffected. He arrived early, left late, spoke decisively. In public, he was unchanged. In private, the nights stretched. He would sit at his desk long after staff had gone, city lights blinking in irregular rhythms, and think about presence again. The word had lodged itself in him, persistent. He thought of moments he had skipped because they felt optional, moments he had assumed would repeat themselves. He wondered how many choices could be categorized that way before they stopped being choices at all. Mara noticed the shift from a distance. She felt it in the tone of emails, in the way discussions moved from legal certainty to cautious negotiation. She didn't celebrate. She had learned that momentum didn't require emotion to sustain it. It required consistency. Her days were structured now by necessity rather than intention. Feeding schedules, appointments, sleep measured in fragments. The baby's needs created a rhythm that left little room for rumination, and she found that grounding. When she thought of Ethan, it was not with resentment but with clarity. He had been absent not maliciously but systematically. and systems once set did not change without pressure. The next hearing was scheduled quietly, framed as procedural follow-up rather than confrontation. Ethan prepared meticulously. Victor warned him that public perception, though unofficial, had begun to influence private judgment. "This isn't about liability anymore," Victor said. "It's about legitimacy." Ethan bristled. "Legitimacy is legal," he said. Victor shook his head. "Not when people stop believing the process is enough." On the morning of the hearing, Ethan paused in the courthouse lobby, watching reflections slide across polished stone. He thought of the first day, the baby's cry cutting through expectation. He had assumed novelty was the weapon. He now understood it had been inevitability. Inside, the proceedings unfolded with restrained efficiency. Adjustments were proposed. Timelines extended. Responsibilities clarified. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. When the judge spoke of long-term considerations, Ethan felt the implications settling deeper than any immediate ruling. This wasn't a chapter to be closed. It was a condition to be managed indefinitely. Afterward, Iris asked him to walk with her. They moved slowly through a nearby park, the city's noise softened by distance. "You're being watched," she said without preamble. Not with malice, with curiosity. Ethan frowned. "I've always been watched." Iris stopped, turned to him. "No," she said. "You've been admired. There's a difference." He absorbed that in silence. "What do I do?" he asked finally. Iris considered him. "You decide who you're willing to be when no one is impressed," she said. That night, Ethan attended a charity event he had sponsored for years. The room was familiar, faces polished, conversations smooth. Yet he felt out of place, as though the environment no longer responded to him in the same way. People were polite, attentive, but their eyes carried questions they did not voice. He delivered his remarks, concise and controlled. Applause followed, measured. As he stepped away from the podium, he realized something unsettling. The applause did not reassure him. It felt transactional, not affirming. He left early. Mara spent that evening at home, the baby asleep against her shoulder. She watched the news silently, volume low, catching fragments of commentary unrelated to her life yet connected by theme. Accountability, transparency, the limits of power. She thought of the question people kept asking her quietly. What did she want from all this? The answer had not changed. She wanted stability, for herself, for the child. And she wanted the truth to remain intact long enough to matter. That required patience, not force. Ethan called again, later than before. This time, Mara answered immediately. "I'm trying," he said without context. She waited. "I don't know how to do this right," he continued. The admission surprised him as much as it did her. "You don't have to do it right," she said. "You just have to do it honestly." There was a pause. "Can I come by?" he asked. "Not tonight," she replied. "Soon, perhaps." Boundaries, she reminded him again, were not punishment. They were structure. Days turned into weeks. Ethan found himself declining engagements that once defined his calendar. He began to notice time differently, not as a resource to be optimized but as a medium through which relationships existed. He attended fewer meetings and paid closer attention during the ones he kept. Colleagues remarked on the change, some approving, others wary. Leadership, he discovered, was often more comfortable when it was distant. The board requested a private session, framed as routine. Ethan entered the room aware that this was not routine. The discussion was careful, respectful, but unmistakably probing. Questions about succession, about risk, about perception. Ethan answered without defensiveness. He acknowledged uncertainty where it existed. He spoke of responsibility not as obligation but as commitment. When the session ended, one director lingered. "You're changing," he said. Ethan nodded. "I didn't plan to," he replied. "No one ever does," the director said. Mara attended a parenting group on a friend's recommendation. She sat quietly, listening to others speak of exhaustion and doubt, of joy that arrived unexpectedly. She didn't share her story in full. She didn't need to. The details were unique, but the undercurrent was familiar. Learning to show up without guarantees. When it was her turn to speak, she said simply, "I'm learning what matters when everything else gets quiet." Heads nodded. That was enough. The first unsupervised visit was arranged with care. Ethan arrived early, hands empty, unsure what protocol applied. Mara let him in calm, observant. She placed the baby in his arms, guiding him gently. He held the child with more confidence than before, the weight familiar now. The baby studied his face, unfocused but attentive. Ethan felt something steady settle in him, a presence that required nothing but attention. He stayed only an hour. When he left, he did not feel relieved. He felt accountable. After that, routines formed. Not grand gestures, not declarations. Just repetition. Ethan adjusted his life around these moments rather than fitting them into leftover spaces. He learned quickly that consistency mattered more than intensity. Mara watched, cautious but fair. She did not rush trust. She allowed it to accrue. Public perception shifted subtly. Not redemption, not condemnation. Curiosity softened into acceptance. Ethan did not address rumors. He let behavior speak. Some praised him quietly. Others remained skeptical. He accepted both responses as part of the cost. One evening, as Ethan sat alone, reviewing notes for a presentation he no longer felt urgency about, he realized something fundamental had changed. The question he asked himself was no longer how to win or how to recover. It was whether the life he was building could sustain honesty without collapsing. The answer was still forming. Mara put the baby to sleep and sat in the quiet that followed, aware of how different it felt from the silence she had once endured. This quiet was earned, shaped by decisions made and maintained. She did not imagine a future without complication. She imagined one with integrity. The city continued its rhythms, indifferent to individual transformations. Buildings rose, markets shifted, stories emerged and faded. Within that motion, Ethan and Mara navigated a shared responsibility neither had fully anticipated. It was not reconciliation. It was alignment around something that mattered more than their past grievances. Ethan understood now that survival was not about avoiding judgment. It was about meeting it without armor. And as he prepared for what came next, new hearings, new negotiations, new expectations, he recognized that the most difficult work ahead would not be public or visible. It would be the daily, unremarkable act of being present, again and again, until presence stopped being a concept and became a habit. If you're still here, you already know this isn't a story about collapse in the way people expect. It's about what remains after the collapse is absorbed, about how lives reorganize themselves around truth rather than image. Like the video if this chapter kept you thinking. Follow the channel if you want stories that stay with you after the screen goes dark. Ethan understood that the danger was no longer in what people said, but in what they quietly stopped expecting from him. That realization settled in during a late afternoon meeting when a junior executive, one he had mentored personally, presented an alternative plan without first seeking Ethan's approval. The room did not freeze. No one glanced at Ethan for permission. The discussion continued, fluid and unguarded, as though authority had subtly redistributed itself without announcement. Ethan listened, contributed, even agreed with parts of the proposal, but as the meeting ended he felt the unmistakable sensation of gravity shifting. Power did not vanish all at once. It loosened its grip incrementally, responding to perception as much as to performance. He returned to his office and stood by the window, watching the city breathe below him. He had once believed leadership was proven in crisis. Now he suspected it was tested more rigorously in transition. The calls that followed that week reflected the same pattern. Partners asking questions that assumed less certainty. Advisors offering suggestions rather than deferring to his judgment. No one challenged him openly. They didn't need to. Influence was no longer automatic. It had to be earned in real time. Mara sensed a similar recalibration, though hers moved in the opposite direction. Institutions that had once treated her as peripheral now approached her with caution and respect. Her counsel spoke to her differently, outlining options without assumption. She noticed how people listened when she spoke, how they waited rather than rushed to interpret. It wasn't validation she felt. It was agency. The baby's presence had not diminished her standing. It had clarified it. Responsibility, she realized, had a way of sharpening perception. The next legal phase unfolded without spectacle. Filings, reviews, assessments. No accusations, no dramatic reversals. Just the steady work of integrating reality into systems that preferred abstraction. Ethan complied fully. He answered questions directly, provided access, accepted conditions without protest. Some advisors worried this approach projected weakness. Ethan disagreed. Resistance, he had learned, was not strength when the truth was already established. Adaptation was. At home, the apartment felt increasingly hollow. He spent fewer nights there, choosing instead to stay in a smaller place closer to Mara's neighborhood when visits were scheduled. It was not a gesture meant to impress. It was logistical, practical. Still, he noticed how the shift unsettled him. The smaller space offered no distance from himself. No grand views to distract from internal noise. He slept better there, though rest came with reflection rather than escape. One evening, after a visit that ended quietly, Ethan lingered in his car longer than necessary. He replayed the interaction in his mind. The baby's attention drawn by sound, by motion. The way Mara observed without hovering. The ease that had begun to form, cautious but undeniable. He wondered whether trust was something rebuilt or something reintroduced once conditions allowed it to exist again. The distinction mattered. He did not yet know which applied. Mara closed the door after him and stood still for a moment, listening to the apartment settle. She felt tired, but it was a constructive fatigue, the kind that followed effort rather than strain. She prepared for the next day, laying out clothes, noting appointments. Her life had become a series of deliberate actions, each chosen with awareness. She did not romanticize the changes. She accepted them. In quiet moments, she acknowledged a subtle grief for what might have been, but she did not let it govern her. The present demanded attention. The media never erupted the way some had predicted. Instead, it circled, cautious, unwilling to speculate without confirmation. Ethan declined interviews. Statements were issued sparingly, factual and restrained. Over time, attention drifted. New stories emerged. Public interest, always finite, moved on. What remained was not reputation damage but reputational ambiguity. Ethan was no longer a symbol of unbroken ascent. He was something more complicated. The market adjusted accordingly. Within his company, initiatives shifted. Ethan delegated more authority, not as abdication but as recognition that systems function better when distributed. Some resisted, others thrived. He listened more, spoke less. When decisions were made, they were explained, not just announced. The change was noted. Some found it refreshing. Others found it unsettling. Ethan accepted both reactions as part of the transition he had not chosen but now inhabited. A board member requested a private conversation, not in the formal setting of the office but over a quiet lunch. The man spoke candidly, outlining concerns about continuity, about perception among investors who valued certainty above all else. Ethan responded with equal candor. He spoke of responsibility not as a liability but as an alignment of values. People adapt, he said. Markets adapt. What doesn't adapt is denial. The board member studied him for a long moment. You're different, he said. Ethan nodded. I am, he replied. And I'm not finished becoming. Mara attended a family gathering for the first time since the hearings began. Relatives asked careful questions, offered support without intrusion. She answered honestly but selectively. She did not feel the need to defend her choices. She watched the baby pass gently from one set of arms to another, observed the ease with which care was shared. It reminded her that community was not something one earned through explanation. It was something sustained through presence. The irony did not escape her. The next court date arrived quietly, framed as a review rather than a reckoning. The judge acknowledged progress, noted compliance, reinforced expectations. There were no raised voices, no gavel slams, just the recognition that what had begun as disruption had become structure. Ethan listened carefully, noting language, anticipating implications. When the judge spoke of long-term arrangements, Ethan understood that the process had moved beyond crisis management into life design. The realization was sobering and clarifying. Afterward, Iris requested to see the baby. Mara agreed without hesitation. The meeting took place in Mara's apartment, modest and warm. Iris observed quietly, her expression unreadable. When she finally held the child, her hands trembled slightly. "He has your eyes," she said to Ethan. Mara corrected her gently. "They change," she said. Iris smiled faintly. "Everything does," she replied. The visit ended without ceremony, but the significance lingered. That night, Ethan found himself sorting through old documents, remnants of a life defined by metrics and milestones. He paused over photographs he barely remembered being taken. Conferences, galas, celebrations that blurred together. He noticed how often he appeared slightly apart from the frame, angled toward the next obligation. He closed the folder and set it aside. The life he was building now did not require evidence in the same way. It required consistency. Weeks passed. Routines deepened. The baby grew, small changes accumulating into visible difference. Ethan learned to recognize cues, to respond without instruction. He learned that attention was not passive. It was active, responsive, sometimes exhausting. He learned that mistakes were inevitable and survivable. Mara observed these lessons unfold without commentary. She allowed space for learning, but she did not soften boundaries prematurely. Trust, she knew, was strengthened by clarity. Externally, Ethan's reputation stabilized into something quieter. He was no longer described solely by success. Articles referenced responsibility, adaptation, a recalibrated leadership style. Some praised the evolution. Others framed it as damage control. Ethan stopped reading. The commentary no longer guided his decisions. He focused instead on the immediate, on what required action rather than interpretation. One afternoon, as Ethan prepared to leave for a scheduled visit, a young analyst stopped him in the hallway. "I just wanted to say," she began, hesitating. "It's different now, in a good way." Ethan nodded, accepting the comment without pressing for elaboration. As he walked away, he considered the weight of that statement. Different was not a conclusion. It was a direction. Mara, meanwhile, faced her own quiet challenges. Fatigue accumulated. Doubt surfaced unexpectedly. She questioned decisions, timing, outcomes. In those moments, she grounded herself in routine, in the tangible needs of the child. She reminded herself that stability was not the absence of difficulty but the presence of response. When uncertainty pressed, she did not retreat. She adjusted. The shared calendar between her and Ethan grew more complex, reflecting coordination rather than conflict. They spoke more easily now, not because tension had disappeared, but because it had been acknowledged. They did not revisit old arguments. They addressed current realities. The shift was subtle but profound. Conflict, when stripped of denial, lost its volatility. One evening, after a longer visit than planned, Ethan lingered again. He did not ask to stay. He did not explain. He simply waited, attentive to cues. Mara noticed. "You can stay a few minutes," she said. They sat in silence, the baby asleep between them. The quiet was not awkward. It was earned. Ethan realized then that the most meaningful moments were no longer dramatic. They were ordinary, accumulated through choice rather than circumstance. As the months advanced, the legal framework solidified. Agreements finalized. Expectations documented. The process concluded not with relief but with acceptance. Ethan signed the final papers with a steady hand, aware that the ink represented not an ending but a foundation. Mara reviewed them carefully, satisfied that structure now supported rather than constrained her life. After the final hearing, Ethan stood outside the courthouse alone. There were no reporters, no observers, just a building that no longer held power over his trajectory. He felt lighter, not because responsibility had lifted, but because it had been integrated. He understood now that survival was not the avoidance of collapse. It was the capacity to reorganize after it, to build systems that reflected reality rather than aspiration. Mara returned home that day and put the baby down for a nap. She stood by the window, watching the afternoon light shift across the room. She felt a quiet sense of completion, not triumph. She had not won. She had established. The distinction mattered. Her life was not defined by what had been taken or revealed, but by what she sustained. That evening, Ethan arrived on schedule. They exchanged a few words, routine and calm. He held the baby, attentive, grounded. As he did, he understood that the most difficult transformation was still underway, not in courts or boardrooms, but in the daily practice of showing up without expectation of reward. He accepted that difficulty without resentment. The city continued around them, indifferent and constant. Cars moved, lights shifted, other lives unfolded in parallel, each with its own quiet reckonings. Within that motion, Ethan and Mara navigated a shared responsibility that no longer felt like contention. It felt like commitment, not to each other, but to presence itself. If you've stayed this far, subscribe and follow now, because the final shift isn't loud, it's irreversible, and this is the chapter where everything that looked stable is tested one last time. Ethan Kwan discovered that endings rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as routine. The day began like many others had recently, measured and deliberately unremarkable. He woke early, reviewed notes for a meeting that no longer felt central, and paused over the calendar shared with Mara. The schedule was full but orderly, a map of cooperation that had replaced conflict. He studied it longer than necessary, aware that this structure had become his anchor. Without it, he suspected, things might still unravel. At the office, preparations were underway for an internal restructuring announcement. Not a crisis response, not a retreat, but a redefinition. Ethan had approved it weeks earlier, after long discussions with the board. Authority would be redistributed. Succession planning formalized earlier than expected. Publicly, it would be framed as foresight. Privately, it was acknowledgement. He had accepted that leadership built solely around one figure was brittle. That truth had cost him comfort but given him clarity. As he walked through the halls, he sensed a calm he hadn't felt in years. Not confidence, not dominance, something quieter. People greeted him without hesitation, without the careful calibration that had once surrounded him. The change was subtle but unmistakable. He had become predictable in the best way. Seen, understood, no longer mythologized. He took his seat in the boardroom and waited. Mara spent that morning sorting through old files, the remnants of a life she had paused rather than abandoned. She worked quietly while the baby slept nearby, the rhythm of his breathing steady. She had declined several invitations recently, choosing instead to conserve energy for what mattered. Stability, she had learned, required discernment. Not every opportunity deserved attention. Not every question required an answer. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan confirming a later visit. She acknowledged it with a simple reply. No embellishment, no hesitation. Their communication had become efficient, respectful. They did not revisit history. They addressed logistics and presence. It was enough. At the board meeting, Ethan spoke with clarity and restraint. He outlined the changes, the rationale, the future. He did not reference personal matters. He did not need to. The subtext was understood. When questions came, he answered directly without defensiveness. When the vote was called, it passed unanimously. The board applauded lightly, a gesture of respect rather than celebration. Ethan felt a closing sensation, not loss, but completion. A chapter had ended without ceremony. Afterward, Victor approached him quietly. "You handled that well," he said. Ethan nodded. "It was time," he replied. Victor hesitated. "There's one more thing," he said. He handed Ethan a folder, thin but significant. Ethan recognized the seal immediately. A final review notice. Not hostile, not accusatory, just thorough. Another layer of scrutiny, another reminder that transformation invited examination. Ethan accepted it without comment. That afternoon, Ethan walked instead of taking the car. The city felt different at street level. Less abstract. More immediate. He watched people move with purpose and distraction, each carrying stories invisible to others. He realized that anonymity, once something he had forfeited, now felt like relief. He stopped at a small cafe and ordered coffee, unrecognized, uninterrupted. It felt like a privilege he had not known he missed. Mara spent the afternoon at a park nearby, the baby secured against her, the world unfolding at a gentle pace. She watched other parents negotiate boundaries and exhaustion, joy and frustration. She felt neither envy nor superiority, just kinship. The baby stirred, and she adjusted his position instinctively, her movements efficient and tender. She thought briefly of the first day in court, the deliberate disruption she had initiated. She did not regret it, but she also did not dwell on it. The present demanded her attention more than the past ever could. When Ethan arrived later, he sensed immediately that something had shifted. Not tension, not conflict, a subtle gravity. He removed his coat, washed his hands, and took the baby into his arms with practiced care. The child studied him briefly, then settled. Ethan sat, attentive, feeling the weight and warmth ground him. Mara watched from across the room, her expression neutral but observant. "There's a review," Ethan said quietly, not looking up. Mara nodded. "I expected that," she replied. "So did I," he said. They sat in silence for a moment. "I'm not worried," he added. "But I'm not dismissing it either." Mara appreciated the distinction. "That's new," she said. Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. "I'm learning," he replied. They spoke briefly about schedules, about the baby's recent changes, about practical matters. There was no urgency, no edge. The conversation flowed easily, shaped by shared responsibility rather than unresolved grievance. When Ethan prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you," he said. Mara met his gaze. "For what?" she asked. "For letting this be real," he replied. She nodded once. "Reality doesn't need permission," she said. That night, Ethan reviewed the folder Victor had given him. The questions were thorough, probing areas he had not anticipated. Governance decisions, personal disclosures, the intersection of public responsibility and private accountability. He felt no panic, only focus. He responded carefully, documenting choices, acknowledging missteps where they existed. He did not deflect. He did not over-explain. He understood now that transparency was not performance. It was alignment. As days passed, the review progressed methodically. Interviews conducted, records examined. Ethan cooperated fully. Some advisors suggested preemptive statements, image management. Ethan declined. He had learned that anticipation often created the very narratives it sought to avoid. He chose patience instead. Mara noticed the strain, though Ethan did not speak of it directly. She adjusted expectations subtly, offering flexibility without intrusion. She did not shield him from consequence, but she did not exacerbate it either. Support, she believed, was not rescue. It was consistency. The baby grew more alert, more expressive. His presence altered the atmosphere wherever he went. Ethan found himself responding instinctively now, without calculation. He noticed when the baby was tired, when he was overstimulated. He learned the language of small needs, the cues that demanded immediate attention. In those moments, the broader pressures receded. Presence narrowed his focus, simplified his priorities. The review concluded without incident. No sanctions, no public findings, just recommendations, adjustments, a formal acknowledgement of compliance. Ethan read the summary carefully, then set it aside. Relief came not as a rush, but as a settling. Another layer integrated. Weeks later, an invitation arrived unexpectedly. A global forum on leadership and accountability, requesting Ethan's participation. Not as a keynote, as a panelist. The shift was subtle but symbolic. He considered declining, then reconsidered. "I'll attend," he told Victor. "But I won't lead." Victor raised an eyebrow. That's new, he said. Ethan smiled faintly. So am I, he replied. Mara watched the coverage quietly when it aired. Ethan spoke plainly, without rhetoric. He did not frame his experience as redemption or downfall. He spoke of recalibration, of learning to lead within constraint. The audience responded with thoughtful engagement rather than applause. Mara turned off the screen before it ended. She preferred the man she knew in person to the one on display. Later that evening, Ethan arrived with groceries, an unremarkable gesture that carried more meaning than any speech. They cooked together briefly, exchanging small observations. The baby slept nearby, the apartment warm and calm. As they ate, Ethan glanced around the room. This feels solid, he said. Mara nodded. It is, she replied, because it's built on what's here, not what's missing. After dinner, Ethan held the baby while Mara cleaned up. He studied the child's face, noting changes he might have missed if he hadn't been present. He felt gratitude, not for forgiveness, but for opportunity. The chance to engage without illusion. When he handed the baby back, he felt a familiar reluctance, tempered by acceptance. He knew now that presence was not about duration. It was about intention. As he prepared to leave, Ethan hesitated. There's something I haven't said, he began. Mara looked at him, attentive. I don't expect absolution, he said. I don't even expect understanding. But I'm committed to this. Not because I have to, because I choose to. Mara considered him carefully. Choice is the only thing that lasts, she said. Just remember that. Ethan stepped out into the night, the city quiet around him. He walked slowly, unhurried, aware of how different this departure felt from those in the past. He was not escaping. He was transitioning. The distinction mattered. Mara closed the door and leaned against it briefly, exhaling. She felt tired, but steady. She put the baby to bed and sat alone for a moment, listening to the quiet. Her life was not free of uncertainty. It never would be, but it was anchored now by intention rather than reaction. She accepted that with calm resolve. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Not perfect, not effortless, but real. Ethan continued to balance responsibility with presence. Mara continued to protect stability without rigidity. The baby continued to grow, unaware of the forces that had shaped his early days, responsive only to care. One evening, as Ethan reviewed a message on his phone, his expression changed. He read it again, slower this time. A request. Not from the court. Not from the board. From an investigative committee, reopening an old matter tangentially related to his company's past practices. Dormant, unresolved. It was not accusatory, but it was serious. The kind of inquiry that did not disappear easily. He looked up at the city lights, the familiar reflection now carrying different meaning. He thought of the courtroom, the baby's cry, the way his life had been dismantled and reassembled around truth. He understood that survival had not granted immunity. It had granted capacity. He typed a response acknowledging receipt, agreeing to cooperate. Then he sat back, the weight of what might come settling in. He did not feel fear. He felt readiness. But he also knew that this inquiry could reach further than the last, touch foundations he believed stable. Across the city, Mara rocked the baby gently, unaware of the message Ethan had just read. She hummed softly, a sound that anchored the moment. The baby's eyes fluttered closed, trusting, unburdened. If you want to know what happens when the past refuses to stay settled, like the video and follow now, because the next question isn't whether Ethan survives, but whether the life he rebuilt can withstand what's coming next.